fare bene il proprio mestiere.
Non diventare semplicemente dei funzionari.
Un'Europa
disuguaglianza.
Mafia significa anche impoverimento.
Un treno che parte, una scuola che apre.
Perché dovrei preoccuparmi?
Capiscono che la mafia è tanto più forte quando una parte.
Come si fa a
La scienza ha senso, i contratti in sé non sono né buoni né cattivi.
So, good afternoon. Welcome to the Festival of Economics 2015. I'd like to introduce our special guest, Martin Wolf. Martin Wolf is a British journalist, widely considered to be one of the world's most influential writers on economics. He is the associate editor and chief economics commentator at the Financial Times of London, and Martin Wolf's column in the Financial Times has been called required reading for the international financial elite. Wolf is the recipient of many awards for financial journalism, for which he was also made Commander of the Order of the British Empire. His previous books include Fixing Global Finance and Why Globalization Works. And another thing important, Martin Wolf was former World Bank economist, and it is also an honorary professor at the University of Nottingham, and also it has been a Forum Fellow at the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum in Davos. Okay, the last book that he wrote is The Shifts and the Shocks, what we are learning and what have still to learn from the financial crisis. It is the book that we are going to discuss this afternoon. There have been many books which have sought to explain the causes and courses of the financial and economic crisis, which began in 2007-08. The Shifts and the Shocks is not another detailed history of the crisis, but we think the most persuasive and complete account yet published of what the crisis should teach us about modern economies and economics. Martin Wolf also scrutinizes what has been done to reform the financial and monetary systems since the worst of the crisis passed. And you will listen, Wolf criticized the policies that caused it as well the responses to it. He calls for abandoning the orthodox thinking and led policymakers to completely miss the signs of the oncoming meltdown. So, in the book and in the conference now, Martin Wolf, I think, will demonstrate that the Eurozone crisis was due to the interaction between powerful global economic and financial forces and the inadequacies of its economy and political structure, and also demonstrates that the Eurozone has not eliminated these weaknesses. So the crisis is not yet over. So if we ask, are we now on a sustainable course, Wolf answer, no. So we have understood you have a radically provocative and ambitious purpose, shake people. So what happened really with this bigger global crisis? Why losses were so large? What was the role of politics in Europe also, with the European Union also? And what are the solutions? A new crisis, this is the last question, and you will going to answer. The new crisis is likely to come again. So, yes, Martin Wolf.
Okay.
First, I hope it will work if I stand up. If not, the translators can come and scream and I will sit down. But I find talking for 40 minutes, sitting down, really very burdensome. There are 3 places at the front. If somebody is desperate, Wolfgang, you can come and sit at the front. Okay. I feel that the least I can do is give my colleague a place at the front.
I do wear the jacket.
So I am immensely honored to be here and very privileged. I am very impressed that I have such a large audience, given that I have been competing with the Prime Minister of Italy and the Prime Minister of France, and far more seductive Thomas Piketty. So I assume you're all here because you couldn't get into Thomas's lecture. I hope you also realize you are not with a superstar.
It's better with that.
Okay, that's fine. That would be much better. You're not with a superstar like Thomas. Now, the theme, I must say one other introductory thing which I like to do when my proudest honor as a journalist, of course, since I'm in Italy, is that I received the Ischia Prize for International Journalism, which was admitted, and surely must be mentioned, was certainly one of the most interesting and indeed extraordinary experiences of my life, since it involved a TV show with an extraordinary number of very, very beautiful, half-dressed young women, which is not a normal part of the life of an economics pundit, and that made it a truly unforgettable experience. And the other thing
Your wife is here.
No, my wife is not here, and she knows. And I went to it. I should mention this since my wife is not interested with my daughter, so she has already been well informed about this event. Italy really is different from all other countries. And the second thing, of course, I should say, as I always do when somebody points out that I am a commander of the British Empire, is that it shows that whatever else the British have lost and are losing, they haven't yet lost their sense of humor, since they are still making people commanders of an empire which has long since disappeared, and most of you probably have forgotten ever even existed. It would be almost like being made a commander of the Roman Empire, wouldn't it? Maybe there are commanders of the Roman Empire. Now, obviously, I am not talking about social mobility. And I would like to make at least one link, which to me actually is important. Social mobility is not a subject I've written about much, but it's a subject I've thought about quite a bit. And I would argue that a necessary condition for a successfully socially mobile society is that it generates over time an increasing proportion of good jobs in its society. That is what made social mobility in many Western countries in the post-war period so successful, because the number of good jobs was expanding very rapidly. That allowed many new entrants into the middle and upper middle classes to have success without displacing a vast number of the children of those already there. In a society which is not generating a large number of new good jobs, what happens, of course, is that parents with the resources will devote all of them to ensuring that their children get what's going, and that makes social mobility, in my view, almost impossible. This links, in my view, with the crisis for the following reasons, as you will see. The crisis represents a huge break in the growth process of the Western world. And this is now nearly a decade long. In fact, for Europe, it is clear this crisis will be 10 wasted years, 10 lost years, rather like the Latin American crisis. In that context, in my view, social mobility is impossible. So there is a link, and I think a very powerful link, between what I'm talking about, though it seems rather remote, to what the dominant concern of this conference is. Now, what I'm going to try and do, no, I'm not going to do it that way. Let's go to the direct technology. I'm going to cover some of the major themes of my book, but focusing on what we should learn from this crisis. And then I hope we'll have plenty of time for discussion. I expect to get through what I have to say in about 35 minutes, 40 minutes, and then, as I understand it, we've got till 6:30, because it's too late for Mr. Piketty. So you can then ask whatever you want. I'm going to divide my talk, like Caesar's Gaul, into 3 sections. First, why this is an important topic. It should be obvious, but I think it really is very important to bring this out, why I think this crisis is such an important event. The second thing I'm going to talk about is my story about what happened. And a particularly important part of this is how the macroeconomic system, the system of the world economy as a whole in terms of income and spending, external balances, savings, and investment, linked with what went on within the financial sector, the interaction between the two. Because I think the reciprocal relationship between the two is the core way of thinking about this, and that will follow in a way from what I say about why this matters, with the failure of economics. And finally, I hope to cover at least some aspects of what is to be done. I should say that, of course, what I'm going to say is in no way a substitute for reading my book. Unfortunately, the book is not going to be published. It appears in Italian, though it's being published in many other languages. You can ask Italian publishers why they think Italians aren't interested. But I hope that those of you who can, and I imagine that will be many of you, will be able to read it in one of the other languages in which it's published, which apart from Italian includes Spanish. Now, why the Spanish are so much more interested in the Italians is very interesting. So let me start with why I think this matters. Obviously, the crisis and its aftermath was a failure of institutions. That's obvious. The institutions that were supposed to generate stability in our economies, indeed prided themselves on achieving stability in our economies, I'll come to this in a moment, failed to deliver that. That's self-evident. But I also think it should be seen as a failure of understanding of what might be called the establishment view of policy. You will remember, or at least many of you who followed the debates before the crisis, that there was a pretty strong orthodoxy in the finance ministries, central banks, and to a large extent, economic establishment. Less true of the economic establishment, but a lot of the economic policy making and theoretical establishment. And it was in the macroeconomic terms that if you had inflation targeting, we'd finally stabilized inflation. That was the objective of central banks. And we had financial deregulation done in supposedly the right way, which basically was the American way, that this would, and I suppose the British way too, that this would generate stable prosperity. Indeed, there was a phrase that was generated at that time to describe what not only would happen, but what, in the view of many of the policymakers, was happening. It was called the Great Moderation. And I quote a very distinguished central banker and economist, Ben Bernanke, no less, in a speech he delivered in, I think, 2005, in which he claimed that central bankers and their wisdom had played an extraordinary role in delivering this great moderation. And Ben is a very intelligent man, I mean, it's clear, just 2 years before the whole system flew apart. So it's pretty clear that people didn't know what they were talking about. I mean, that's pretty obvious. That's pretty fundamental. The people in whom the world had put their trust didn't understand what was going on. That's pretty important. And I think the reason they made this mistake is they ruled out the problems of the interaction between inflation targeting and the financial system. They ruled out the problems created by this by assumption. And they did not in particular understand a concept which I think had been, to which I owe, and I have to say I got to the writing of this man rather late, so I'm part of the guilty number, I'm clear about that. And that was a phrase of a man called Hyman Minsky, who was considered very much an outcast in academic economics, quite an important one. He had enormous influence on somebody called Charles Kindleberger, who wrote a classic economic history of manias, panics, and crises. But Hyman Minsky, interesting, a Chicago economist, but very much in the post-Keynesian tradition, rejected this orthodoxy. And in particular, the phrase that I think is so valuable is the phrase that stability destabilizes. That in a period of stability, which is believed in, trusted in, people, ordinary people, but quite particularly people in the financial sector, will want to take more risk because it looks as though it's safe and it looks very rewarding. And as Minsky pointed out very clearly, the easiest way to, there's a difficult way to take risk, which is to start a genuinely entrepreneurial, innovative business. And there's an easy way to take risk, which is to increase the leverage of yourself, your institutions, and the economy. And what they did, as I will show you very dramatically, is they largely took the latter route, creating an immense increase in indebtedness and in the leverage, the debt relative to equity of all the core financial institutions of the global system, just as Minsky warned. The failure to realize this was general and pervasive in the orthodox system, in the policy system. It was a huge failure of imagination not to realize what was happening, and it was completely general. And I think that even after the crisis, it is stunning to me how few economists, and I put my hand up, I'm one of those people who've learned from this, I think, have recognized how wrong their prior views were and how much they needed to change the way they thought about how the economy really worked with real people as opposed to completely theoretical, abstract people who are not Minskian. But in fact, we are. We are just that for a whole host of reasons I don't have reason to explain. And I think this failure to recognize this and to adjust the way we think deserves the contempt and scorn of the public. So that's the first, if you like, the theoretical point, but an incredibly real theoretical point. Beyond this, I'd like to bring out the fact that this has been an immensely costly crisis. I think that, if I'm right, I am not putting up, I'm just putting up a chart about the Eurozone. And I will discuss very briefly what's happened to the US and UK. So what I do in this chart, just to give you some idea of what's happened, is I have a very simple, I have Eurozone aggregate GDP since 95 up to 2000, it's actually 2014. That's the last period, the end of 2014. The red line shows actual GDP of the Eurozone. The blue line shows what would have happened if the really already miserable growth trend, it was about 1.5% a year, of Eurozone GDP from 95 to 2007 had continued. And the green line, which you can read on the right side, shows the deviation of actual GDP below potential GDP as a proportion of potential GDP. And what it shows is that by the end of 2014, GDP was roughly 14% below trend. And as you can see from the slope of the green line, it continued to fall quarter by quarter. In the first quarter of this year, it's probably close to flat, but no real recovery. And if you look at the red line, you will see very clearly the most important point, which is that Eurozone GDP has experienced two recessions, the first one after 2008, another one after 2010, and GDP is still, at the end of last year, about 2 to 2.5% below the pre-crisis level, never mind the trend. So these are enormous losses. By the way, just to relate this to what happened in the US and UK, their growth trends had been more dramatic, faster than the Eurozone. By the first quarter of this year, the US GDP and the UK's GDP are both roughly 16 to 17% below the pre-crisis trend. So these are enormous losses relative to expectations. Everybody assumed these trends will continue, and these economies have experienced losses which cumulatively, if they are not recouped, and there is no sign that they will be recouped, on the contrary, there's every sign that they will continue to accumulate, these will accumulate over time to many, many times GDP. And by the way, a crisis of this scale, which had such a long-run consequence, not recouped, is more or less unprecedented in these major economies. It's by the way, even the Great Depression was recouped by the end of the 50s. Maybe this will be. So then that question arises, and let me move to my second theme, is, well, why did this happen? So my argument is that there were two closely interwoven causes. I don't have the time to go through all of them, but essentially very big macroeconomic shifts which interacted with the financial system to allow the financial sector in the policy environment I've discussed to go essentially crazy. So the macroeconomic trigger was sometimes been called a savings glut. It could be called an investment dearth. In any case, a set of changes in the late 1990s and early 2000s which reduced the real interest rate on safe assets worldwide dramatically, and I will show you that in a few minutes. These changes was associated with a big rise in global imbalances, a huge rise in net capital flows across the world, and huge credit expansions in the capital importing countries, of which the most important in macroeconomic terms were the US, UK, and Spain, a crucial country in the European context. I believe these shifts were driven by both external and internal changes. The external change that matters was the decision, and I think it was a policy decision by most of the emerging world that mattered, to start running very large current account surpluses because they learned from the Asian and other financial crises they could not take the risk of large net debt inflows from the developed world. The financial system was too unstable for them to manage since they didn't produce a reserve currency. They couldn't really manage the consequences of very large capital inflows denominated in foreign currencies. And in addition to that, and this is links with the theme, and I discuss this at length, shifts in income distribution in our societies towards savers, a big rise in corporate profits as a share of GDP, big rise in income towards the top of our societies, not all of them, but in many of our societies, which had the net effect of shifting income to savers and away from people who would naturally spend. And for a short time, we made up for this by promoting, and this was particularly true in the US, an enormous credit expansion and credit bubble which blew up. So that's the macro story, but already in what I've said, this fits in with the financial sector. I've talked about this credit bubble. So this was an environment, very low real interest rates, which triggered large rises in the value of long-term assets, of which the most important were houses. These are the classic long-term assets. Declining real interest rates, easy credit environment, encouraged to expand, and in the context of rapid financial innovation, rapid financial liberalization, an extraordinary credit boom. And these two things were, broadly speaking, how things fitted together. This chart looks a bit complicated. I think sort of summarizes this very simple story. The red line is my proxy for global real interest rates on safe assets. It just so happens, I think there's a lot of evidence to support this proposition, that the UK, my country, has been offering index-linked government bonds, which have been AAA or close to AAA for the last 30 years. And it so happens the US has been doing it for less time, but the US so-called Treasury inflation-protected securities track the UK data very well. And you will see that since the mid-1990s, the real interest rate has gone through three periods. Prior to 97, the real interest rate was close to 4%. You can read this on the right-hand side. From 99 till about 2007, it was 2. So it halved very, very suddenly. And after the crisis hit, it fell down to 0. These are the three stages to catastrophe. Now, obviously, the 0 real rates, which we're now familiar with, have become normal, are depression numbers. They indicate we are in a structural slump. It's about as clear as you can possibly be. If the real interest rate is 0 year after year, you're in a structural slump. What happened between 97 and 99, the shift from 4 to 2, my view is the most important thing that happened then was the biggest financial crisis before the last one, the Asian financial crisis, which led to an enormous shift away from willingness to borrow, as I've indicated, in the emerging world, above all in Asia, and an extreme determination to build up foreign assets. So there was a huge decline. You will notice, in addition, 3 other lines. These are US real house prices, UK real house prices, and Spanish real house prices. And you will see just about 97 to 99, they started to rise very, very rapidly. And in fact, they doubled in the case of US and Spain. They tripled in the case of the UK. And after the crisis hit, they all went back down again. And basically, I think that the collapse in real interest rates, which was linked with this credit expansion that followed, created the ideal conditions for a rise in house prices. These rises in house prices improved the value of the collateral against which people borrow, and this fueled what was simply the biggest house lending spree we know of in Western history, and an enormous expansion in the balance sheets of the banks that lend, obviously of the liabilities of banks, and of course of the debt of the households that incurred these borrowings. Just to indicate a few of the other things that happened, I've already talked about the global imbalances. These are the net capital flows across the world relative to global GDP from the IMF. So back in 96, net capital flows were very small. After 97, 98, they started to explode upwards, and by 2006, which was the peak, they were roughly 8 times as big as they'd been before the crisis. At that point, At that point, roughly speaking, 3 regions were generating surpluses. The oil exporters, the Asians, those are the yellow ones, and the old industrial countries, particularly Germany and Japan. And there were 2 regions, and only 2 regions, borrowing all this money. And they were the countries with these credit bubbles. The big blue area is the US itself, which is far and away the biggest importer of capital at that time. And the purplish one is what I call peripheral Europe. What was peripheral Europe? It was Western Europe, Ireland and the UK, Southern Europe, Spain, Portugal, Greece, to a lesser extent Italy, and Central and Eastern Europe. And after the crisis, these were the countries with significant current account deficits. Italy's was not so big, it's a slightly different story. Some of the others went to 10% of GDP or even bigger. And that was what ended when the crisis hit. It led to a huge contraction in these deficits. You can see them contracting, and as they contracted, a very large amount of demand was taken out of the world economy. So on a macro level, you can see the picture here, I think, very clearly. Now the next couple of charts will indicate what happened within economies as this happened. So I'm going to focus on 2 economies that I know well and aren't yours and have very remarkable stories. So the first one is what happened to the private sector gross debt relative to GDP in the most important economy in the world, the US. And you can see, I just focus on the period between 94, 5, 6, and 2008, that it roughly doubled relative to GDP in just 10 years. And that has never happened before in the US. That's an extraordinary development. By the way, this explosion of gross debt occurred in just essentially 2 sectors. The household sector, which is at the bottom. You can see the very rapid expansion of household debt with the kink about 98, which was when, you will remember, the house prices started to rise. And the green one at the top is the financial sector, which, if you look at the whole green one, you can see simply exploded in scale, both by its borrowing and lending vis-a-vis the rest of the economy and internally in the financial sector. In fact, gross liabilities of the financial sector grew 6 times faster than GDP over the 20 years prior to the crisis. Just a staggering expansion of the gross debt of the financial sector. Now, obviously, if this is going on in the financial sector, something must be going on, as it were, in the leverage of the financial sector. Now, I don't have a comparable chart to this for the US, so I don't know what it would look like. This is the UK. The UK banking sector is incredibly large because it has a very large global position. In fact, to people's astonishment when I tell them this, back in 2008, the gross assets of the UK banks were more or less as big as the gross assets of US banks. And the main reason for the difference is that a lot of the US banking system is the so-called shadow banking system, which are banking activities which don't occur within banks. And the UK banking system had huge global assets and liabilities. It was very globally exposed. I want you to focus just on the black line of this chart. And what that chart shows, the black line shows you, was that up to the 2000, the ratio of debt to equity in the UK banking system was reasonably stable at about 20 to 1. It's a very highly leveraged business, banking. There's lots of debt and rather little equity. Banks are in general very fragile institutions because they have so little equity relative to their liabilities. That's what makes them prone to runs. That's what makes banks, and has always made banks, risky. You in Italy should know that because you invented it. This system is your invention, for better or worse. But if you look at what happened between 2000 and 2008, there was an absolute explosion of leverage in the UK from 20 to 1 to 50 to 1. At this point, it took a 2% decline in the value of the assets of the British banking system for it to become insolvent. And that's effectively what happened in 2008 and why we had to pump in an enormous amount of public money. So as the leverage of the financial sector as a whole grew in terms of its total debt, just its total debt, equity didn't keep up. It wasn't encouraged to keep up. No regulator cared about this. And it became unbelievably fragile in this way. So as I've said, the crisis was a consequence of this huge policy and institutional failure, which allowed these things to happen without check and without awareness of the risk. I'm arguing that it was ultimately due to changes in the world economy, which appeared to the practitioners in the central banks to justify easy monetary policy and rapid credit expansion. Inflation was well under control. Exchange rates were very strong because there was all this capital flowing into countries like the US and the UK. The main macro targets were being achieved. The financial sector seemed to be very profitable and prosperous. They were completely relaxed. But of course, as I've already indicated, credit expansions like this work via the financial sector. It exploded in size, in absolute size, and it became far more fragile. Of course, it's always fragile. It makes promises it might be unable to keep without support. That, as I've already said, is the characteristic of a system which has huge debt relative to equity. But it became far more fragile and far bigger than ever before. And we still live with the legacy of this because despite some reduction, if I may go back to my earlier chart in the US case, you can see there's been deleveraging, but it only brings the US that's up to 2013, 2014 doesn't change much. It brings the US roughly back to where it was in 2003-04, and the same is roughly true, as I will show you in a minute, for other economies. So when the crisis hit, we then adopted the most expansionary monetary policies in the history of the world. So this shows what central banks did when the crisis finally hit and people realized that they had been living in cloud cuckoo land. With extreme speed, the central banks cut their lending rates down from their more normal levels in the 5-6% down to zero. The US did it fastest. The Bank of England followed almost as quickly. The ECB, in what I regard as one of the most comic moments in monetary history, tried very hard in 2011. It got to 1%. It found that utterly horrifying. So it started raising rates. You can see this little blip up in 2011 to 1.5%. It said, oops, it realized it had made a terrible mistake, and it's plummeted down, and not because it wanted to essentially to zero. So we're now in the very amusing situation that the highest interest rate afforded by any of the four major developed countries' central banks is 0.5%. That's tight money nowadays, and that's the Bank of England. Just to give you an indication of the scale of this crisis that they're dealing with, the leverage overhang and the difficulty of generating growth, I'd like to point out that in the case of the UK, we have roughly 320 years of monetary history, and the lowest rate that the central bank, the Bank of England, has ever granted to the banks in support of them prior to this crisis, and this is through 2 world wars, the Napoleonic Wars and the Great Depression, the lowest rate it ever used was 2%. And now we've been at 0.5% for 5 or 6 years. Just to indicate that this might be in no way exceptional, as I've gone in this chart back to 94, and I show you that in the case of the Japanese, they've been here since 94, so for 20 years. In addition to this, there has been an absolutely dramatic expansion in the balance sheets of the central banks as they bought assets to lower the prices, lower the yields and raise the prices of other assets. So this shows an enormous expansion in the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England, both of which have reached about 25% of GDP. The ECB hit 30 plus in 2012. After that, it allowed the central bank to shrink its assets relative to GDP. And the best way of thinking about what Mario Draghi is doing right now through QE is it wants to bring it back up again to where it started in 2012. And the Bank of Japan, after 20 years of zero rates, is so unhappy about what's happened, it's now pursuing a policy which is completely on its own. You can see the blue line shooting up into the stratosphere as it essentially monetizes an ever-increasing part of the debt of the Japanese public. A major purpose of these very low rates is to get some demand growth in our economies after the crisis. But another purpose is to facilitate deleveraging, allow people to pay down debt. And I just want to bring out what's happened here. You can see Italy here as well. There have, in fact, been 3 economies, which were my most important cases of the major countries, Spain, the UK, and US, where you have quite significant declines in private sector debt relative to GDP, very small in Germany, effectively no decline at all in France, Japan, Italy, or Canada, and, of course, universally, very, very large rises in public sector debt relative to GDP. And that, of course, was the other part of the response to the crisis, which was to allow fiscal deficits to expand. I think it was absolutely the right thing to do. And, of course, the indication is that one part of why the private sector could deleverage is that the public sector leveraged. There's a lot more public sector debt than before. That was absolutely the right thing to do, but it was an inevitable part of this. It became very unpopular. And that's because it's become so unpopular that austerity has become the dominant theme of public finance now for many years, for 3 or 4 years across the developed world. One of the most important things I want to point out here before I go on, and it's incredibly important, is this underlines the extent to which thinking about the public sector's debt without thinking about what the private sector is doing before the crisis and after makes it impossible to have sensible fiscal policy. It's the persistent failure of the thinking about the public finances in relationship to our economies is the failure to think about what the private sector is doing and how it will drive the public sector. Finally, I'd just like to cover briefly what's going on in the Eurozone. And my story on the Eurozone is, in a way, a microcosm of what I've told you about the world. So this is a chart for the imbalances in the Eurozone, which is very much like my global chart. You will see the red line that I have here shows very roughly the aggregate current account of the Eurozone. And you can see that up to the crisis, to 2010, 9 or 10, it was pretty close to balance. This is relative to Eurozone GDP. But within it, huge imbalances emerged as Germany and, to a lesser degree, the Netherlands and a few other countries generated gigantic surpluses. Demand grew much more slowly than potential output. And other countries generated enormous deficits, which offset them. And I argue in my book, they're very closely related, because the monetary policy, the ECB, worked at that time to offset the contraction in demand, particularly in Germany and the Netherlands, by encouraging demand and encouraging credit expansions elsewhere. The crisis hit, the capital flows stopped flowing, and you can see them ceasing as all the current account deficits disappeared in the Eurozone. And the IMF now forecasts that by 2016 or 2017, every Eurozone member country will be in surplus. The Eurozone will be the largest surplus region in the world. Mario Draghi's recent policy has driven down the euro and will help it. But of course, what this means is that the Eurozone is becoming a great big Germany. It's becoming a huge region trying to generate demand, which it can't generate internally, through the external account. It is now the biggest surplus region by far in the world. It's one of the reasons, by the way, the emerging countries are now in trouble, quite a lot of them. It's one of the reasons, because they run the counterpart deficits. I believe that in the long run, this is not a viable solution for a continental-sized economy. It must generate internal demand. But the policies of the central bank has achieved one very important thing, and particularly in 2012, and that is you can see these very high 30-year bond yields for Italy and Spain at the top, and you can see that as a result of its commitment to do whatever it takes, and the actions of the central bank, it has cut down yields very, very dramatically towards those in other countries. So the yields are generally very, very low, and that's a tremendous success. It's a real achievement, and it was something that I very much strongly supported, that to use the central bank. But the other point I would like to bring out here is that if you look at these yields, these are now nominal yields, you can see that the highest is 3%, Germany is down there at 1%, Japan is at 1.5%. A world in which major countries, and these are the major developed countries, can borrow for 30 years at 3% nominal is a slump world. That's a world in which people are basically saying that the real interest rate is 1% or less. And this, astonishingly, is a world in which the major concern of public policy making is that fiscal deficits should contract. The government can borrow essentially for 0 to 1% real, and yet the most terrifying idea is public debt. I think this is a very, very profound policy mistake. The Eurozone story, the US story is bad. The Eurozone story is, I'm afraid, really grim. And the recent recovery should not fool people about this. So what I'm showing here is what has happened to real GDP and real demand in the Eurozone and the US since the crisis, the two major Western economies. So you can see the huge recession from the first quarter of 2008. It's very, very clear in both demand and GDP. Then the US started a recovery, and actually since the first quarter of 2009, the US real GDP has been growing at about 2% a year. That seems to be pretty close to the weakest recovery on record in the US. It's very poor, very, very poor, but it is a recovery and it's steady. The Eurozone, unfortunately, after a comparable recovery to 2010, 2011, then had a second round of crisis, and that was the crisis that hit, of course, Ireland and Portugal and Greece, and then, and I've already shown you this, Spain and Italy. And that generated a whole new round of collapses in demand and GDP. There is now evidence of a very weak recovery in the Eurozone's GDP. That's the light blue line. But just to bring out how bad this has been, aggregate real demand in the Eurozone as a whole in the last quarter of last year was still 5% less than it had been before the crisis hit. 5% less than it had been nearly 7 years earlier. And this shows what happened to the GDP of individual countries, which... What? Yeah, that's all right. I just thought I'd remind you of what's happened to your country, though you surely know it. So I put in the Eurozone as a whole, Germany, Italy, Spain, Greece, Ireland, Portugal, and for comparison, the UK. So Germany and the UK have both had miserable recoveries, but their economies are at least somewhat bigger than they were before the crisis. They're the green and red line. The Eurozone I've already showed you. Not the Eurozone I've already showed you. That's the light blue line. I'd just like to focus on what's happened to the crisis-hit countries. First, you can see why Greece is a unique case. The Greek collapse, which is the brown line, is unique, unbelievably severe. GDP is still more than a quarter below the pre-crisis period, and after the recent experience with this government, it's falling again. In the case of Italy, it's about 10% below the pre-crisis peak. There's a very weak signs of recovery. It's going to take, if you assume that Italy were to grow 1.5% a year, it's going to take 6 years before Italy gets back, roughly 6 years before Italy gets back to the pre-crisis level, which will be 2021, in which case it'll be 13 lost years. That's a pretty big mess. That's a pretty big mess. If Spain continues to grow as it has done, and everybody is very pleased with Spain, it'll just be 10 or 11 lost years. Ireland, it's slightly better. It's really had a relatively strong recovery. But it's clear the crises for the countries that I've described is a very, very deep and profound event. And finally, I think it's the final chart on what's happened, it has been a massively disinflationary event, and in the very worst way. Since German inflation is only 1%, that's the red line, the brightish red line, German inflation core inflation is only 1%, which is way below the Eurozone's target. So here is the country that should have strong demand and strong inflationary pressures, but its inflation is 1%. All the countries that have weak economies and are trying to regain competitiveness against Germany tend to have lower inflation than that, and indeed that is the case. They all have inflation now close to zero, which means that the inflation is doing nothing to erode their private and public debt. On the contrary, it's leaving it constant in real terms, and that's making it very, very hard to manage the public finances and the private sector debt overhangs. And it's one reason, and there are many others I don't have time to go through, why we really haven't solved the crisis. Now, why have we got into this terrible mess, which I've now described very clearly as a long-run consequence, apparently, of the crisis and some of the difficulties before, which one economist, Larry Summers, calls a secular stagnation? I think you can argue that to some degree, pre-crisis trends were unsustainable. I think it's often exaggerated, but to some degree, what was going on pre-crisis was an illusion because of the credit expansion. We didn't have solidly grounded growth. I think that's true. The second reason we got into this terrible mess is the crisis bequeathed a huge private and public sector debt overhang, which I've already described and discussed. The third reason is the crisis damaged the financial sector and the functioning of the financial sector, and so the economy in the short and the long run. And finally, policymakers adopted very bad post-crisis policies, and I think that's particularly true in the Eurozone, with far too little fiscal support and far little attention paid to aggregate demand and support for the economies. So that seems to me where we are. Now let me then, with that, talk about what we need to do to fix this incredible mess that we are in. And the first thing we have to do is to recognize we're in a big mess and recognize how big the failures were. The first thing is to restore growth. And to do that, to my mind, a necessary condition is stronger demand. There's clearly inadequate demand in most of our economies. And the best way to deal with demand, which seems to be a long-term weakness in demand, when real interest rates are as incredibly low as they are now, is to go for much higher public investment pretty well everywhere. This seems to me an obvious thing to do. I've argued for this in the US, I've argued for this in the UK, and I've argued for this in the Eurozone. Of course, I've got absolutely nowhere, but I'm convinced I'm right. The second thing I think we need to do is better cooperation between monetary fiscal policy and even what Milton Friedman once called helicopter money, which really means using the monetary system to support fiscal policy. As I've already showed you, we've had huge expansions of the balance sheets of the central banks, but that was just done in order to substitute monetary assets for government bonds predominantly, which are assets very similar to government bonds, to money. You have to buy an awful lot of government bonds when yields are already so low to make much difference to an economy. Much more effective, in my view, is to use the monetary system directly in support of public spending. And I see no reason in the current situation, when the private financial sector is not generating credit and money, why the government shouldn't do it directly. The second thing that clearly needs to be done, in fact, I attended a very interesting discussion of this in the Eurozone, is there needs to be debt restructuring, both private and public. There needs to be more capital put in banks, which then allow debt write-offs and write-downs. That capital could come from governments, it could come through other means, but it seems to me pretty clear we should be accelerating and encouraging the restructuring of debt. This overhang has to be limited, to be eliminated. And I think in some cases, and Greece is the most obvious, this of course includes substantial rewriting down of clearly unpayable government debt. We had a discussion of that this morning. I think there's not much more to be said. We need also to encourage supply. There's a lot of evidence that the supply potential of our economy is growing slowly. Productivity growth is very slow. We need pro-growth structural reforms, of which the most important, I think, are product sector liberalization, financial sector reforms, which make the financial sector more pro-growth, and direct support for innovation through the universities and research activities of government linked with the private sector. We need financial reform, which is pro-growth. That is to say, we need financial institutions that are not just about financing, as they are predominantly now, property transactions. It's amazing how much of our financial sector is devoted to that, but actually supports growth. And we need to look at our tax system with a view to what will actually promote growth. In the Eurozone, as I've already indicated, I think this Greater Germany strategy is impossible. It is impossible for the Eurozone as a whole to expect enough demand to come from abroad to sustain really buoyant demand in the Eurozone as a whole. I think it's crucial that the Eurozone becomes what I call an adjustment union. That means higher spending, and private or public, it doesn't really matter, in the core countries to allow the adjustment elsewhere. And in fact, I've made this point very often, and I am incredibly unpopular, given that the inflation target of the Eurozone is 2%, accept that, given that there should be large changes in relative competitiveness, then inflation in Germany, in the Netherlands, and other such countries should be 3 or 4%. That would tell you that you are succeeding. That's not happening at all, and that's one of the reasons this growth is so weak. And debt restructuring is particularly important in the Eurozone because the debt overhangs in the public sector particularly so large. None of this is going to be at all easy, and particularly if the Eurozone and Japan continue to choose policies of weak exchange rates, net exports rising, which are, I think, beggar my neighbor policies, other countries have to accept external imbalances, and there really are no countries in the world able to bear this. We need to stabilize finance, and this is just the other side of what I've already talked about. We need far more capital in our banks. We need radical deleveraging of economies with elimination of excessively favorable treatment of debt. I think in the longer term, we should be thinking of more radically still. I think a lot of the loans which we are used to making as loans should be equity sharing contracts. That's particularly true for house purchase. And we should actually think about direct use of state-created money. And I know that is unbelievably unpopular. Finally, I think we have to think very seriously about getting better balance of the world economy. My view is it makes no sense at all to have huge net flows of capital from the poorer countries in the world to the richer countries in the world, which can't use them, as we see. They can't use them at all, merely because we can't generate successful financial systems to support emerging countries borrowing. And one way out of that is to have much better insurance for developing country deficits, which I think means a much larger IMF. And that is, of course, exactly what Keynes was arguing for at Bretton Woods. We need much more cross-border equity flows rather than bond flows, and linked with this, very substantial global monetary reform. And I noticed that Joe Stiglitz is in the audience, and he's talked a lot about this. In other words, we need a lot of change. Of course, we're not going to have these major changes, and that's why we're going to continue to live in a short-term mess and a long-term mess. So my conclusion, I apologize I've gone on a little bit longer, we have to get away from the complacent view that what's happened is a perfectly reasonable crisis. Everything is going rather well. I think it's pretty clear from the figures I've given you, and that's why I gave you so many figures, that it's been a disaster, and it remains one. It was caused, I think, if we think about it, by the interaction between the macroeconomy and financial fragility, and the economists' tendency to separate macroeconomics with a very simplistic, idealized model of macroeconomy with no finance in it, and the financial sector as if the macroeconomy doesn't exist. And that is really how economics used to work, with a few very distinguished exceptions. That's just an intellectual failure of a huge kind. We need to make the global economy much better balanced, and that needs a lot of reform, and we need to make finance far less fragile. And we haven't achieved these things. So we haven't got out of the crisis. That's obvious, self-evident. I've given you figures of that. And we haven't fixed the system enough to be confident we won't have another one. On the contrary, I think we can be pretty confident we will have another one. So apart from that, how did you enjoy the play? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you. A couple of questions. First one, it was a big disaster, but in the global crisis, we suffer, we in Europe, the lack of adequate European political power, because the plight of the Eurozone is a special case in the big global crisis. The question, which should be the role of the European Union and what Germany should do? And then another question, you said that we need a higher public investment in the Eurozone especially. So, but how it is possible, for example, in Italy, or if we have, especially here, so a huge public debt?
Well, it's very, very difficult to feel optimistic about fixing these problems in the Eurozone, and I have a very large part of my book is about the Eurozone, and I've only touched on it. Indeed, I would claim that one of the contributions of this book is the amount of time I spent on Europe, because nearly all the books on the crisis have been written by American economists and Americans, and most of them, there are a few distinguished exceptions, actually think that this is a purely American crisis and nothing happened anywhere else. And they are not aware fully of what has happened in Europe. Let me give you a broad answer, and then a more narrow answer. Personally, I was always against the euro. So everybody knows this. Not all British economists were against the euro, and not all British economists were against joining the euro, but I was one of them. And the reason was that I have tended to the view that a necessary condition for a currency union in the modern world, that is a modern world with fairly large welfare states and large expectations of the public, from the public of government and government policy, that this requires fairly substantial mutual insurance mechanisms. We can discuss the nature of those insurance mechanisms, but they need fairly substantial mutual insurance mechanisms. And all existing currency unions, which are of course states, have over the last 100 years, and that's true of course of Italy as a currency union as it was with the lira, and the UK, and obviously the US, Australia, developed large regional and personal insurance mechanisms. These are mechanisms that ensure, this is an example that Paul Krugman has often used, ensure, and this took 100 years to achieve, that when you have a crisis say in California's public finances, that the Californian financial system will continue to function anyway, because this is backed by the treasury of the whole. Now, it took the 30s to achieve that. I mean, it didn't happen easily. And in different ways, all currency unions have substantial risk-sharing mechanisms. The Eurozone was created without those mechanisms, without the political union that would have supported those mechanisms, other than the European Central Bank itself, which is a not unimportant insurance mechanism. And to be quite clear, Mr. Draghi in particular has used this mechanism with incredible energy and activity. But it really is not enough to provide this mutual insurance. So I think it was bound to be a huge problem. Now, there are two solutions to that problem when you hit the crisis, when you hit to that. Three solutions. One solution will be to ensure that the countries you have in the currency union are so similar that they're almost always going to be subject to similar shocks and behave in similar ways. That would have been possible if a different group of countries had joined, but it didn't happen. So that's gone. That is disappeared, unless it breaks up, which I'm not recommending. So this doesn't seem to me a good idea. The second possibility is to create the instruments of a pooled insurance mechanisms of various kinds, which means some sort of joint fiscal system. You can discuss, I won't have the time to go into the details, in the crisis. And a very limited amount of that happened with the European Stability Mechanism and its precursors, but it's relatively small, €500 billion, not big enough to insure major states against these risks. But that would be the second thing to do. And the third thing you can do is combine the support from the central bank, which has happened, with policies which are conducive to rapid adjustment. And the only mechanism you really have once you lose the monetary mechanism, which is essentially Eurozone-wide, the only mechanism you really have is fiscal. And that's gone. So, because the rules have eliminated, the new rules, fiscal compact is ruled. So that leaves you with essentially with absolutely brutal, pure gold standard mechanisms. So what that means is that we are back to the 19th century with the slight qualification that the central bank is there, and that's important, which is adjustment occurs through wages and prices, and i.e. through deflation, and long periods of deflation. And that, unfortunately, makes the debt problems worse, as we are seeing. Now, none of this was a surprise because it was baked in the cake. I don't know how you solve that problem. I really don't know how you solve that problem. This is what frightens me. But the least bad thing you could do, it seems to me the most obvious thing to do, would be to propose, well, let's distinguish, which is actually used to be part of German budgetary rules, current from investment budgets. Let's accept that investment for borrowing for investment is legitimate, which always uses the golden rule, and that this is an obvious thing to do at the Eurozone-wide level, and also in those countries which have big needs for investment and can borrow. Germany can borrow at -2% real for 30 years. If you can borrow at -2% real for 30 years, -1 to -2, it's really quite hard to argue you can't invest. I mean, it's rather peculiar, to put it mildly. So that would be one possible mechanism. I don't expect it to happen, but that would be one possible way of getting at this problem. I don't think the risk-sharing mechanisms seem at all plausible other than that at the moment, though I have some ideas about the longer term, about how that might. I think my equity sharing contracts are particularly important in the Eurozone because that way, when something goes wrong, risk will be shared by the people providing the funds and by the people who receive the funds. That seems to me appropriate. But I don't have any simple solution because all the sensible solutions seem to be blocked by the nature of this currency union, which remains a currency, which is a currency union, all right, but it is among states which in all other respects remain essentially sovereign. And that's a very, very peculiar structure. I don't believe that it's one that can survive like that indefinitely, and at some point major reform has to occur. And that probably will mean a head-on clash, but it's got to happen.
Okay. Just a curiosity, and then a question. Just a moment. Just on here. Today in Italy, banks are really unpopular. Italians think that banks are really worse. So what should be done to make banks fulfill the societal role that they should be playing? How can we prevent fraudulent behavior, lack of transparency, predatory, discriminatory lending, so anti-competitive practices? Your opinion about that?
Well, I'm again rather like the mechanism I've taught. I wouldn't start from here, but this is where we do. this really is a very difficult problem. So there are a couple of things that I think we can think about. First, we in Britain, I was a member of our Independent Commission on Banking, and we recommended in the UK something which is rather similar to what the US used to have with Glass-Steagall, which is pretty close to complete, not complete separation of retail from investment banking. And this is very unpopular in Europe. There was an investigation of this by so-called Liikanen Committee. They put forward not dissimilar ideas, and it's pretty clear they have been rejected. But I do think that if we forced banks to focus on retail lending and forced investment banking to stand on its own feet, a lot of investment banking would disappear because it wouldn't be adequately profitable because it's cross-subsidized because the state backs retail banking. And retail banks will be forced back onto their bread and butter activity, and we would know that that's what their activity is, and they would be judged by how well they do it. I also think that there will be much better institutions if better capitalized. As I've already indicated, I think transparency is a very big issue. That's a very complicated one, but I think it is very important that as much information is published about the nature of the bank's balance sheets as possible. But I actually think the biggest single issue is that in most countries, the banks are a very increasingly narrow oligopoly. And they are in a near monopoly position. In Britain now, we have 6 banks that do all banking, essentially. The US is vastly more concentrated than it used to be. I don't know how many big banks there are in Italy, but only 2 or 3, I think.
Yes.
And it's inevitable, as I can see it, that very large institutions of this kind will tend to be somewhat exploitative. So I think the solution to that, and I argued this in my last column, is to increase capital requirements most for big banks, partly because they have the biggest risk in terms of aggregate consequence for society, and partly because it will encourage them to break up. Finally, I've become very tempted by the idea that the government should consider, probably through public-private partnerships or some other means, actually trying to create new specialized banks or financial institutions. New technology might make this easier, which actually perform functions like supporting new businesses, supporting innovative new businesses. Europe has almost no venture capital, for example. We should be asking ourselves why that is the case. What can be done to promote this? And that is sort of around the periphery. I don't think all this would fix this, but I think thinking about this and getting away from sort of just trying to survive with these huge balance sheets that Europe has. Eurozone has incredibly huge balance sheets, as the UK does. I think thinking in these ways, in these long-term structural reform ways, is part of where we want to go.
Okay, there was a question like there. The microphone is coming. Can you hear?
Thank you, Mr. Wolf, and thank you for making economics so clear to those of us who aren't economists. I wanted to ask 2 questions connected with politics, and they're both connected together. The first one was connected to the answer in the sense you've already given, and it would be this. If banks are so enormously influential on politics, on everyday life, and if, in effect, ordinary citizens who pay their taxes are, in effect, the lenders of last resort to keep the banks afloat, I think you could also make an argument, following on from what you've just been saying, that the citizens ought to have a seat at the board of the major banks. And I've shot myself in saying that, because it's not the kind of point of view I've ever advocated in the past. But I mean, I think it was very clear from your presentation that the mass of the people are paying the consequences of decisions that went very wrong by people who thought they knew what they were doing but didn't. So that's the first point. And the second one follows on from that, and it's a question about governance. One of the things that really struck me about your presentation was just the if we can be making decisions now in Europe to go for an export-led recovery, which might lead to catastrophic disasters in the emerging economies, and if the savings glut in the emerging economies led to credit gluts which have led to disastrous consequences for us, it seems to me, and I'd be interested to have your opinions on this, that we need to have some sort of discussion about global governance of economic issues. Do we need, you mentioned Keynes, do we need some new kind of Bretton Woods in which people sit down round a table and try to come up with structures which everybody understands, which can control, at least attempt to control, these enormous economic fluxes that you've been talking about? Thank you.
Okay, these are two giant questions, and but let me try and answer them as briefly as I can. I've actually flirted with the idea that the taxpayer, qua ultimate guarantor of the financial sector, should actually be represented on the board. And the argument is as you put it, so I think that's pretty clear. The argument against is that it creates potentially quite a damaging confusion of roles. And I mean this in the following respect. The way we think we're dealing with this problem is through regulation. So this is a very, very highly regulated industry. And we have always had, and since the crisis we have much more, a very complex regulatory structure that oversees the banks. I think it's pretty easy to see that if you had the regulators regulating the banks from outside, and the government was represented, or possibly the regulator, it's most likely to be the regulator because they're the people who know most, is actually on the board of the institutions they're regulating, you have a potentially quite serious conflict of interest. In particular, if anything goes wrong, the bankers will say, well, you can't blame us, you were on the board. It can't be our fault, it's your fault. You are therefore implicated in it. So I've come to the view that unless the government actually buys the banks, and I'm not discussing that at the moment, though there are situations in which I would, during the crisis I thought, so in the case of RBS, for example, so I take the British bank RBS, the British taxpayer is the majority shell, owns about 86% of the bank. Well, they might as well have people on the board, which they have, but they're not really using that leverage. But my instinct at the moment has been that as long as we have this sort of external regulatory and supervisory structure, having the government representatives on the board itself is just going to create tremendous confusion. And it's an unsatisfactory way of going about it anyway. I would rather that we had institutions we thought we could fail safely. And to do that, or be managed safely, to do that we have to do, I think, more structural things, much more equity, and the breakups I've discussed, and new banks. On the global governance, that is an important part of my book's discussion. Now, to be fair to them, the major governments are aware of the problem, and they have got a process actually underway, which is probably the least known intergovernmental process of all. It's called MAPS, the Mutual Assessment Program, which is run by the IMF for the G20. Okay? And the fact you haven't heard about it tells you how effective it is. And the reason is quite clear. What the program tries to do is to integrate the plans of all the major countries. So they say, what are you intending to do? Where do you think your economy is going to go? And then they say, it's perfectly reasonable, well, let's see what you're all doing together. Does it add up? And they go through the process and they find, not to their surprise, that it doesn't add up. And then they say, well, what are you going to do about it? And the answer to that came there, none. And the fundamental problem, and I want to be very, very clear about this, is, of course, there is no governmental... I mean, we've already discussed there is no Eurozone mechanism to make the Eurozone economy add up. It hopes that the rest of the world will allow the Eurozone to add up, by putting the results of its crazy policies into the rest of the world in form of its huge surpluses. The world as a whole can't do that, obviously, because we're not trading much with Mars these days. But of course, each government hopes that the other governments will find some way of adjusting. And that is a practice what happens. There's no mechanism. Now, there is a mechanism, and I'll come to this in a moment. It's a very important point. Keynes, of course, thought, which is why he failed utterly, completely, totally, that an intergovernmental mechanism could be created that would force the most powerful surplus country in the world to make the adjustments which would make everybody else's life easier. And the most powerful surplus country in the world, and I'm sure you all know what that was, the US, said nuts to that. We're going to have this run the way we want it. And that worked perfectly well until they discovered actually it didn't work. And the US then made the sensible decision that it would start financing all the deficits. And that's what the Marshall Plan was. The US got there much quicker than Germany has in this crisis to this very simple point. If you're the surplus country, you have to finance the deficits. And then the US deficit went away. Since then, at the world level, we've had another policy. And the policy has worked pretty well, and it's the policy the Eurozone and the Japanese and the Chinese are effectively all following now. And the policy is the US will fix it. And the reason, it's not stupid. The reason is the US produces the dollar. It therefore has essentially unlimited international purchasing power, as Giscard d'Estaing complained. So if it runs large deficits, and we all want it to run large deficits, it will just print more dollars. The Fed will run an even easier monetary policy, and it will keep on expanding monetary policy to expand demand and therefore balance the world economy. And in brief, that's the whole argument of my book of how we got into this mess. And that is what the world is trying to do again. Okay? And that's not as crazy. The problem is that the US consumer is pretty well hopelessly over-leveraged. The US relative to the world economy is much smaller than before. And in order to do this now, the US, instead of having expansionary credit, needs interest rates which are significantly negative in real terms, which is really hard to do. So we're sort of reaching the limit of that policy. But nobody has any other alternatives, and there are no global systems making that possible. And it's one of the reasons why I'm really pessimistic about the long-run consequences. But those are my best answers to why we are where we are and why it's so difficult to fix. But at the moment, right now, everybody hopes the US will fix it.
We have a question right here, please, and then over there.
Everybody's running away, so I think...
No. Well,
thank you very much also from my side for the excellent presentation. I have a question about your argument about global imbalances, which has very much focused on the current account, of course, which is kind of the Ben Bernanke savings cloud argument. And of course, there's an alternative to this one, which has been put forward by the BIS especially, and also some people like Ellen Ray at the London Business School, which is that instead of the current account, which are net capital flows, we really have to look at gross capital flows to understand what has been going on. And of course, this is because for investment, savings may not be as important as what Claudio Boria has called financing, or you have called this credit creation here. So I was just wondering what your view is on the importance of gross capital flows versus the current account.
We collect more questions right here, please. Just a moment. Here. Okay, and then over there.
May I ask about the your macroeconomic analysis, the central bank funded investment programs? Now, the closest we've come to this in the world, I mean, the Eurozone isn't going to be the place where we will experiment with this, given the legal, political, ideological objections to this. But there are other places in the world where you could probably start this. And I think the country where we become the closest is probably Japan. And my question to you is how, we've seen a massive expansion in the central bank balance sheet. There's through Abenomics, an investment program going on. So this is sort of an experimental setting for this. How do you see that going?
Okay, over there and then here.
most of the accounts of world events over the last 20 or 30 years have put much more emphasis on technology than you have today. And I was wondering, you did talk a bit about possible technological innovation in terms of addressing some particular problems of distribution, but I'm wondering if I'm correct in saying that you don't think technology has been technological change has been a particularly important factor in the phenomena you've been talking about.
Thank you. Over there.
So you mentioned that many people think that many people are very pleased with the case of Spain. And my question is whether, because we have some positive growth data during the last semesters in Spain, but we have like a huge unemployment rate, a huge amount of private and public debt. We have a scary deflation. So what do you think about Spain?
Thank you. Do we have other questions? No, at the moment.
Okay. I'm going to start with the easy ones and go to end with the last one. The most difficult, because time might cut me off, which will be a great help. Okay. I think the answer is I'm not. It seems to me clear that technology has played a role in the normal way that technology is part of what generates rising prosperity. But since all the evidence we have is that we've had a particularly low period of particularly low rises in prosperity, then the question is sort of a negative one, which is why is technology doing so little for us? I think it is plausible that that part of the reason we are constantly getting so close to, if you like, stall speed in our economies is that the underlying trend growth, as I already indicated at one point, has been falling. And it's been falling because for the Western world, our rate of productivity growth has been falling. Now, that's a very controversial view. I feel very passionately this is true. So there is a negative question about technology. Why isn't it doing more for us? And my view is it's not doing more for us because with one exception of the internet, which is a very important technological innovation with quite significant effect, actually the technological revolution, quote unquote, we're going through at the moment, that is to say, over the last 3 decades, and particularly over the last decade, with exception of the internet, which clearly affected the US economy for about 7 or 8 years, we are actually in a period of extraordinary technical stagnation. And the idea that we're in a period of extraordinary technical innovation is a bit of hype that floats from Silicon Valley. Now, it did, however, play quite an important role in financial innovation. There's no doubt about that, because a lot of the stuff that you can do in the financial sector, particularly creating structured financial products and a whole slew of other products which nobody could understand, would have been impossible without the computer revolution. But that's, of course, an old revolution which has been going through the financial markets now for well over a generation, and it's clearly an important factor which I do discuss in the book. So I would agree that part of the reason that the financial sector became so impossible to manage is that the financial sector was able to do things in innovating products and in trading them, which was previously impossible. And technology was very important there. And finally, technology was clearly important, though I don't think it was the dominant factor, but it was an important factor, and I do discuss that, in shifting the distribution of income. And that's part of the demand story. There is one other aspect, I should have mentioned that, which I do discuss, which is technology has become a particular part of the investment by firms in the Western world, and the prices of the technological investments they've made have been falling rapidly. So they have rising real investment with falling nominal investment, and that's one reason that nominal demand is weak and demand is nominal. So that's what I think about technology. I think your description of Spain is correct. I understand that it's much better to grow, that the first difference is positive rather than negative. It's much nicer if the first difference is positive rather than negative. But the least Spain has is 10 lost years, In practice, I think it will be much more than 10 lost years. I have no idea when unemployment will go back to where it was pre-crisis, if ever. And of course, as you rightly say, there's been a gigantic increase in public and private debt, which is long-standing, which will be long-lasting. Now, in 2006-07, I wrote some columns which were unbelievably unpopular in Spain. In fact, I felt at one point I could hardly visit the country because I said it was headed for the most monstrous crisis, which would last for a very, very long time. And that is, in fact, the case. Why did this happen? Partly because the Eurozone relied on this boom to keep going, and nobody paid much attention to the instabilities, and particularly the creditors didn't worry about it. And Spain, to an extraordinary degree, was seduced by this bubble. The result, quite simply, will be something whose shadow, it seems to me, will be cast across the economy for a generation. There's just no way out of that. The more quickly it can grow, the more successfully it can grow, the quicker it can get out of this. Just as long as it stays in the euro, and the Eurozone has more or less its present policies, there doesn't seem to be much alternative to what they're doing now. I was asked, I think I failed to answer that. You answered this. What could Italy do on its own? Well, it's rather like Spain on its own. If Spain acts on its own, for instance, enormously to increase its fiscal deficit, the ECB will not back it. Everybody knows the ECB will not back it. And spreads, I think, will explode upwards again. So I think that the problem with being in the Eurozone, and that's the obvious point of being in the Eurozone, is that even though you're quite a large country, you have lost an enormous chunk of your sovereignty. And you just have to accept that. That's just the story. Wolfgang. Well, Japan, unfortunately, hasn't done this. In fact, they've wasted it. You know, this is a very interesting question about monetary policy and fiscal policy. So the Japanese central bank has purchased a very large part of the outstanding gross debt stock of the Japanese government. You could have imagined an alternative in which the Japanese central bank would simply have financed larger fiscal deficits. The actual expansion of the balance sheet of the Japanese central bank in that situation could have been significantly smaller than it was. But the injection of spending power in the economy would have been significantly bigger. It would have been, I think, a much better targeted way of doing it than pretending that the central bank policy can and should be completely independent of the fiscal decision and operate purely through the balance sheets of the private sector. That's essentially how it works. The balance sheets of the private sector, when you're near zero or very low levels of government bond yields, really don't give you much bang for the buck. As you rightly say, in the Eurozone, there's nothing else to work on. But I think the crucial thing is that the government. The crucial thing is to actually get spending in the economy up. And since I don't think the balance sheet adjustment of the central bank has a big effect on the private sector spending, and you can see that in Japan, not much, the best way to get spending up is to get the government spending up. In other words, to use the central bank for that purpose. I know that for all sorts of ideological reasons, expanding the balance sheet of the central bank in order to purchase vast quantities of private assets is seen by many as a perfectly safe, reasonable, and effective thing to do, and using the same balance sheet to expand spending by the public sector is seen as insane, irresponsible, and leading to hyperinflation. I just don't understand the logic. Finally, gross net. I tried to cover this in the book. I'm not saying that I have succeeded. I think Claudio is an incredibly intelligent man, and I have to say I've always failed fully to understand what he's talking about. And that's probably my stupidity. But broadly speaking, this is what I think, as I've tried to explain it in the book. Central banks are interested in levels of spending relative to potential output in their economies in order to sustain what I would call full employment, and they would call hitting inflation, making sure that inflation hits target. And if, under a number of fairly plausible assumptions, that is what they are. More or less, they are the same thing, and that's more or less what they're trying to do. If you're running the monetary policy of a country that is receiving very large net capital inflows, and we can discuss, I'll come to in a moment to the link with the growth, what that means is that you have a structural deficiency of structural bleeding, if you like, of demand abroad. So the central bank has to pursue a policy whose net effect is to get important sectors of your economy to spend much more than their income consistently. And that's what the US central bank did. It got, to take the US most obviously, it pursued a monetary policy whose effect was precisely that, to get demand in the US to operate at a much higher level than income in the United States year after year after year. The only way to do that was to create a huge asset bubble and gross credit flows that supported that credit bubble and supported the prices of the assets against which people were borrowing, which were houses. So I see these things as all fitting together. Now, this led to a huge expansion of the gross balance sheets of the US private sector in order to generate those net spending. And a great deal of that expansion of the gross balance sheets, of course, was acquired by foreigners. So I see that as a consequence, or not a causal factor. It's a necessary consequence of the set of policies that I've described. So in my view, net, by which I mean income and expenditure, drives gross, because net income and expenditure is what the central bank is actually trying to target. I have no real problem, since it's a general equilibrium situation, in which if you tell this story slightly differently, as long as you understand that's what the central bank is trying to do. It is trying essentially a Keynesian policy, though it doesn't admit it. And the credit flows and all the rest of it are a consequence of this sort of story. So if you want to stop that happening, now their answer would be, as I understand Claudio, and Bill White is to me a little more easy to understand, Bill's answer will be, well, the thing to do then is just not to have allowed these credit flows to have occurred, and the gross capital flows and the gross balance sheet expansion. This is perfectly true. But then, of course, and I understand this, the Central Bank of the United States would definitively have said that because of the consequences of these policies, we are going to pursue a policy that will allow deflation in the US. That's our objective. And how long do you think the Federal Reserve would have been allowed to continue that policy? A year? 2 years? It's not a policy objective the Federal Reserve is allowed to have. Therefore, for the BIS isn't responsible for anything. It can ask for any damn fool bit of nonsense it wants, and it does, consistently. But they are not elected or responsible to any elected official. I won't go through the discussions that I know have occurred in the BIS between BIS officials and the major central bankers. Everybody knows what the central bankers are supposed to do because they've been told by parliaments or the Congress what they're supposed to do. What they're supposed to do is generate enough inflation and enough spending to keep their economy in, quote-unquote, something that looks like aggregate balance. The problem is that when they do this, the whole economy blows up. This is a really big problem. This is the really big problem, which in my view, Claudio and Bill, no, not Bill actually, Claudio assumes away, because Claudio assumes that for some strange reason, if you didn't do this, everything will be fine. Why? So I think that the problem that the policymakers have faced is much deeper and more worrying than the one they described. The analytical part is not the core of this. The key part of this was that without the policies that had these dire consequences, they would not have been fulfilling their mandate, which is why Mario Draghi has finally got to where he is now, and in my view, he's going to go on doing this sort of stuff, because that's the sort of economy he's dealing with, and that's the really frightening dilemma. We are way out of equilibrium. Why we're way out of equilibrium is, I think, the great challenge for economists to understand. I could go on for much longer, but I've already gone not too long. And thanks for the question, because it's incredibly important. And I think the BIS critique is incredibly valuable, and I discuss it. I just fundamentally disagree with their view of what a plausible alternative would have been.
So time is over. Thank you so much, dear Martin. I think that you haven't given us too much hope in the future, but we thank you anyway for this refreshing book and analysis of tonight. Thank you so much, and we hope that you're wrong. See you. Well, hopefully.
Fare bene il proprio mestiere.
Non diventare semplicemente
un'Europa.
disuguaglianza.
Mafia significa anche impoverimento.
Un treno che parte, una scuola che apre.
Perché dovrei preoccuparmi?
Capiscono che la mafia è tanto più forte quando una parte.
Come si fa a la scienza ha senso che i contratti in sé non sono né buoni né cattivi. Ha senso che i contratti in sé non sono né buoni né cattivi.
special guest, Martin Wolf. Martin Wolf is a British journalist, widely considered to be one of the world's most influential writers on economics. He is the associate editor and chief economics commentator at the Financial Times of London, and Martin Wolf's column in the Financial Times has been called required reading for the international financial elite. Wolf is the